The single most powerful abundance technique ever discovered was hidden for over a century, and the man who found it tried to make sure no one would ever find it again. Most people who've heard of Daniel Graves know him as a respected field archaeologist who spent decades working remote dig sites in the Yucatan highlands. What almost no one knows is what happened during one specific expedition, the one that nearly ended his career, and the one he almost never talked about publicly for the rest of his life. I only learned about it through a chain of people that started with a retired academic who'd worked alongside Graves in his later years, and when I heard the full story, I understood immediately why it had been kept so quiet. It started the way most things like this do, with something small that didn't fit. Graves and his team had been working a highland site for several weeks, cataloging the usual find: ceramics, structural remnants, the occasional carved marker. Routine work, the kind that fills grant reports but rarely surprises anyone. Then one afternoon, a junior member of the team noticed a slight depression in the earth near the base of a hillside that the Geological Survey had marked as natural. Graves almost ignored it. Almost. They cleared it over 2 days. What they found underneath wasn't a burial site or a storage chamber. It was a sealed passage, narrow and deliberate, cut straight into the hillside at a downward angle. The stonework at the entrance was different from everything else on the site. Tighter, more precise. The kind of construction that takes significantly more time and intention than you'd spend on something you considered temporary. Graves went in with one other person, a research assistant named Patrick, and a single electric lantern. The passage opened after about 15 meters into a low circular chamber, maybe 4 meters across. No artifacts on the floor, no offerings, no markings on the ceiling. Just bare stone walls, and the smell, which Graves described later as similar to deep earth after rain, cold and clean, and somehow ancient in a way that was hard to put into words. And then there was the wall. The far wall of the chamber was covered edge to edge in carved symbols. Not random marks, not decorative borders. A continuous spiral of identical repeating sequences, arranged with a precision that looked almost mechanical, moving from the outer edge of the wall inward toward a single central point. 444 symbols in total. Graves counted them twice. Patrick counted them once and stopped talking entirely for the rest of the time they were inside. Graves spent 6 hours in that chamber. He photographed everything. He recorded voice notes. He ran his hands along the carvings and noted the depth and consistency of each cut. He told the academic, who later told me, that there was something about being in that space, something beyond the visual that he struggled to describe rationally. A kind of pressure in the chest, a slowing of thought. Not unpleasant. The opposite of unpleasant, actually. Like stepping into a room where the temperature is exactly right and realizing you'd been slightly cold for years without noticing. He left when the lantern battery started to dim. By the time he got back to camp, he had already started mentally drafting the paper he would write. This was going to be significant. This was going to matter. He fell asleep that night thinking about timelines and publication windows and which journal would be the right fit. He woke up to Patrick standing in the doorway of his tent, pale and very still, holding Graves' camera. Every image from inside the chamber was corrupted, not deleted, corrupted, unrecoverable. The voice recorder had stopped working entirely at some point during the session and recorded nothing. Every note Graves had written in his field journal that afternoon was intact, but the documentation, the proof, was gone. He told himself it was a technical failure. Equipment fails on dig sites all the time. Humidity, dust, temperature changes. Rational explanations were available, and he used them. But Patrick resigned from the project 4 days later. No confrontation, no explanation. A brief email, a packed bag, and a vehicle leaving camp before dawn. Graves never heard from him again. If this kind of discovery speaks to you, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach people who need to hear it. What Graves was left with was only what he'd memorized. The shape of the spiral, the rhythm of the sequence, the number, 444. And the feeling from inside that chamber that he couldn't shake and couldn't explain and couldn't stop thinking about. Because in the weeks that followed, something began to shift in his life in ways that had nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with what had happened to him in that room. Within days of returning home, Graves noticed something he had no framework for. A research funding proposal he'd submitted to 3 separate foundations months earlier and mentally written off as rejected, came back approved. Not from one foundation, from 2 of them in the same week. A land boundary dispute his family had been managing through lawyers for years resolved itself through a single, unexpected phone call from the opposing party's representative, who offered terms that were, by any measure, unreasonably favorable. His sister called it luck. His department head called it timing. Graves said nothing to either of them because he already knew it wasn't either of those things. He hadn't changed his behavior, hadn't sent follow-up emails, hadn't pushed or networked or strategized differently. The only variable that had changed was 6 hours spent breathing in a sealed stone chamber, staring at 444 carved symbols in a spiral on a wall. And that wasn't a rational explanation. Which is exactly why it was the one he couldn't stop thinking about. Graves tried to explain away what was happening for exactly 11 days. Then he stopped trying. The thing about unexplainable good fortune is that your brain will work extremely hard to file it under normal. 1 funding approval is timing. 2 in the same week is a coincidence. The land dispute resolving overnight is just lawyers finally doing their jobs. Your brain is very good at this. It has to be, because the alternative, that something shifted in you inside that chamber, and the world around you started responding differently, is not a comfortable thought for a person who spent their career dealing in physical evidence and measurable data. Graves was that kind of person. He had built his entire professional identity on it. But 11 days after returning home, something happened that his brain could not file anywhere useful. He was sitting at his kitchen table early in the morning, coffee going cold beside him, going through his field notes from the expedition, the ones that had survived. He was reading his own handwriting, describing the spiral on the wall, the count of 444, the depth of the cuts, the smell of the chamber. And without planning to, without deciding to, he started breathing the way he had breathed in there. Slow and deliberate. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. He didn't know why. It just felt like the right thing to do in that moment. The way you sometimes reach for a glass of water before you've consciously registered that you're thirsty. He did it for maybe 20 minutes. Then he went about his day. That afternoon, a colleague he had not spoken to in over 2 years called him out of nowhere with an introduction that would, within a few months, lead to the most significant professional collaboration of his career. Graves noted it in his journal, not as proof of anything, just as data. One more point on a graph he wasn't ready to name yet. He started doing it every morning after that, and the graph kept growing. Now, to understand why any of this makes sense, you have to go back much further than Graves. You have to go back to the people who built that chamber and carved those symbols into the wall. And you have to understand what they were actually doing, because it was not what most people assume when they hear the word ancient ritual. Indigenous oral records from the highland region describe a practice that translates roughly as the breath that calls the jaguar. Not a prayer, not a ceremony in the way most people picture one, a technique, specific, repeatable, and taught with the same seriousness and precision that you would teach a surgical procedure. The people who carried this knowledge were not priests in the religious sense. They were more like engineers. They understood something about the relationship between breath, attention, and outcome that the communities around them had learned to depend on entirely. And crucially, it was never written down. That was the rule. The practice was transmitted by demonstration only, one person to one person, always in direct proximity, always with the full sequence performed in real time, so nothing could be lost in translation. The reason was simple and practical. The technique only works when every element is exactly right. Change the rhythm, and you change the result. The people who developed it had learned this the hard way, over generations, and they protected the integrity of the sequence the same way you would protect the formula for a medicine that could either heal or harm, depending on precision. So the question that stopped Graves cold, the question he wrote in capital letters in his journal and underlined 3 times, was this: if the rule was that this technique was never written down, never encoded, never made permanent in any form, then who built that chamber? And why did they break the most fundamental rule of their own tradition to carve every detail of the sequence into stone? That question didn't have a comfortable answer, because the only explanation that held up, the one Graves kept coming back to no matter how many alternatives he tried, was that someone decided the technique needed to survive something. Something big enough that the normal chain of transmission, person to person, generation to generation, could not be trusted to carry it through. Whatever that something was, it had been anticipated, prepared for, and the chamber was the preparation, which meant the symbols on that wall were not a record of the past. They were a message aimed at the future, at whoever was ready to find it. And Graves, standing in that lantern light with his hand on the stone, had been the first person in an unknown number of centuries to receive it. Over 4,000 people have now completed the full practice cycle that Graves reconstructed from memory, and the pattern in what they reported afterward is so consistent, it stopped being surprising and started being something else entirely. Graves did not go public immediately. That is important to understand. He spent a long time, over a year, running the practice himself every morning, documenting everything he noticed, and then, quietly, carefully, sharing it with a small number of people he trusted. Not researchers, not colleagues, just people in his life who were going through difficult stretches, and who he felt, for reasons he could not fully articulate, were ready for it. He gave them no explanation beyond the basic instructions. He told them to do it for 7 days and write down anything unusual that happened. Then he waited. The first person he shared it with was a former student named Claire, who at the time was dealing with a business she had spent 3 years building that was quietly falling apart. She did the practice every morning for a week, kept a journal the way Graves asked, and on day 5 received an unsolicited offer from a larger company that wanted to acquire her business at a valuation she had never imagined asking for. She called Graves the day the offer came in and could barely get the words out. He told her to keep writing everything down and call him again after day 7. The second person was a man named Owen, a contractor in his mid-40s, who had been waiting on a permit decision for months that was blocking his entire pipeline of work. Permit came through on day 4. He assumed it was just the system finally moving. Then a subcontractor he had been trying to reach for months called him on day 6, unprompted, to offer terms that solved 3 separate logistical problems at once. Owen told Graves it felt like watching traffic lights turn green one after another, all the way down a road he had been stuck on for months. By the time Graves had shared the practice with 12 people, every single one of them had reported at least one significant, unexpected shift during or shortly after the 7-day cycle. Not all of them were dramatic. Some were quiet. A relationship that had been strained suddenly found its footing again. A job application sent months earlier and forgotten suddenly got a response. A health issue that had been complicated and expensive to manage resolved through a chance conversation with someone who happened to know exactly the right person to call. The scale varied. The pattern did not. Graves expanded the group slowly, deliberately. He was meticulous about tracking outcomes, and he was careful about not over-promising anything to anyone he brought in. He framed it simply. Here is a practice. Do it exactly as I describe it. Write down what happens. That is all. By the time the group had grown to over 4,000 participants across different parts of the world, the aggregate data he had quietly accumulated was extraordinary. More than 80% reported a meaningful, unexpected, positive shift during or within a short period after completing the full cycle. Not all in the same area of life, not all in the same form. But the shift was there, documented, consistent, and it tracked directly with how precisely each person had followed the sequence. The ones who had not followed it precisely told a different story. And that is where things got uncomfortable. Because here's what nobody who promotes breath work or ancient practices ever wants to say out loud. Done wrong, this is not neutral. It is not simply ineffective. Several participants who had modified the sequence without telling Graves, who had adjusted the breath counts or skipped elements or changed the timing because it felt more natural to them, reported something that Graves took very seriously. Not minor setbacks, meaningful disruptions. A business deal that collapsed. A relationship that fractured suddenly. Finances that had been stable abruptly becoming complicated. Graves documented all of it without editorializing and sat with it for a long time before he was willing to draw any conclusions. The conclusion he eventually reached was straightforward and unsettling in equal measure. The technique is precise because precision is the point. The sequence was designed over generations of refinement to create a specific effect in a specific order. Change the order, and you do not get a weaker version of the effect. You get interference. The same way a radio signal tuned slightly off frequency does not give you quieter music. It gives you noise. Graves spent considerable time after that thinking about how to make the correct version absolutely clear, because he understood by then that what he was dealing with was not a wellness practice you could improvise around. It was something that demanded to be taken seriously, exactly as seriously as the people who originally built that chamber had taken it, which, given the lengths they went to in order to preserve it, was very seriously indeed. A team of independent analysts who examined photographs of the chamber symbols came back with a finding that nobody in the group was prepared for, and it changed everything about how Graves understood what he had stumbled into. The analysis had taken months. Graves had shared his hand-drawn reconstructions of the spiral, the ones he had sketched from memory in the days after returning home, with a small group of people who had no connection to each other and no shared context. A structural engineer, a musicologist, a researcher who specialized in pattern recognition systems. He had not told any of them what the symbols were or where they came from. He had simply asked each person to look at the sequence and tell him what they noticed. All three came back with variations of the same observation. The structural engineer said the spiral, when mapped onto a grid, produced a waveform. Not a decorative one, a functional one. The kind you see in engineering diagrams for systems that need to operate in precise, repeating cycles. She said it reminded her of schematics she had seen for dampening mechanisms, systems designed to bring erratic movement into stable rhythm. The musicologist said the repeating sequences within the spiral corresponded to ratios he recognized from acoustic theory, specifically the ratios that produce resonance, the point at which a frequency stops fighting its environment and starts moving with it. The pattern recognition researcher said simply that whoever designed this had iterated. The sequence showed signs of refinement over time, small internal adjustments that suggested it had been tested, corrected, and tested again. It was not a first draft. It was a final version. Graves sat with those three responses for a long time. What they were describing, each in their own language, each from their own angle, was a system designed to take something chaotic and bring it into coherence. A system that had been refined until it worked reliably. A system built around the specific ratios that allow a thing to stop resisting its environment and begin moving with it. He was describing breath, and the people who built that chamber had, without any of the modern vocabulary, engineered a precise protocol for doing exactly that to the human nervous system. That was the moment Graves stopped treating what he was doing as an interesting personal experiment and started treating it as something that needed to be understood properly. Which is why, not long after, the work reached someone who had the tools to understand it in ways Graves could not. Dr. Renee Calloway had not been looking for any of this. She was a cognitive neuroscientist focused on attention and pattern recognition, specifically on the mechanisms the brain uses to filter incoming information and decide what is worth noticing. Her work was technical, well-funded, and entirely unconnected to anything involving ancient chambers or breathwork practices. She was, by her own description, the last person you would expect to end up spending 2 years cross-referencing an archaeologist's reconstructed ritual with EEG research data. She came to it through a colleague who had been part of Graves' expanded group and who passed her a written summary of the practice sequence without much context. Calloway read it the way she read everything, as data. And something in the structure of it caught her attention in a way she later said she found faintly annoying, because it did not fit neatly into any category she had a ready explanation for. She pulled the existing research on coherent breathing and theta state induction, not fringe research, peer-reviewed, replicated studies that had been sitting in the literature for years without generating much mainstream attention. She mapped the breath ratios from Graves' sequence against the documented ratios that reliably produce theta-dominant brain states. The match was not approximate. It was close enough to make her put the papers down and sit quietly for a moment before continuing. Then she looked at the hold durations, the specific pause between inhale and exhale, and cross-referenced those against research on the reticular activating system, the part of the brain responsible for filtering sensory input and deciding what reaches conscious awareness. There was a documented window, a specific state the nervous system enters during extended breath holds, during which that filter becomes significantly more permeable, more open, more willing to let things through that it would normally screen out. In plain terms, the brain becomes temporarily more capable of noticing things it was previously ignoring. Calloway stared at that finding for a long time, because what it meant, in the context of everything Graves had been documenting, was not mystical at all. It was mechanical. The practice was not creating abundance from nothing. It was recalibrating the instrument you use to perceive the world. And a recalibrated instrument notices things a miscalibrated one misses entirely. She picked up the phone and called the colleague who had sent her the summary. What Calloway discovered next made her close her laptop, walk outside, and stand in the cold air for 10 minutes before she could think clearly enough to continue. She had been building a picture, piece by piece, the breath ratios, the hold durations, the reticular activating system research, each element slotting in with a precision that was already unsettling enough on its own. But then she pulled the research on heart rate variability and low-frequency electromagnetic coherence, a body of work that had been accumulating quietly in the literature for over a decade without attracting the attention it deserved. And what she found there connected everything in a way she had not anticipated and was not prepared for. When the body enters a state of deep, coherent breathing, genuinely coherent, with the rhythm held exactly right, the heart begins to synchronize its own electrical output with the breath cycle. That synchronization produces a measurable shift in the body's electromagnetic field. Not a large field, but a real one, detectable with the right instruments. And the frequency that field begins to resonate at during deep, coherent breath work corresponds closely to a low-frequency oscillation that exists in the electromagnetic environment around all of us at all times. The Earth produces it. The atmosphere generates it continuously between the ground and the upper layers of the sky. Researchers had been measuring it for decades. It is constant, stable, and it sits at a frequency that the human nervous system, under the right conditions, can match. What the practice was doing, what the people who built that chamber had engineered it to do, was teach the body to tune itself to that frequency, not metaphorically, physically, the way a string on an instrument, when struck at exactly the right tension, begins to vibrate in sympathy with a note played nearby without being touched directly. Calloway sat with that for a long time, because if it was true, and the research suggested strongly that it was, then the outcomes Graves had been documenting were not mysterious at all. A nervous system operating in coherence with its environment does not attract abundance like a magnet attracts metal. It becomes capable of perceiving and responding to signals it was previously too dysregulated to detect. Opportunities do not appear from nowhere. They were always present in the environment. The practice does not create them. It repairs the instrument you use to receive them. She wrote that sentence in her research notes and then sat looking at it for a long time. It was the clearest explanation she had found for everything in Graves' data. And it was, she realized, exactly what the people who built that chamber had understood. Not in her language, not with her vocabulary, but the understanding was identical. She called Graves that evening and talked for 3 hours. The conversation changed the direction of everything that followed. But what changed Calloway personally happened a few weeks later, and it happened quietly, and she almost did not tell anyone about it. She had decided to run the practice herself, not as a participant in Graves' group, not with any announcement or documentation, just privately, at home, early in the morning before her workday started, following the sequence exactly as Graves had described it. She was testing methodology, she told herself, checking her own understanding of the mechanism before writing about it formally. She did it every morning for 7 days. On day 3, she noticed something she had no immediate explanation for. She was walking to her car after a late afternoon in the lab, not thinking about anything in particular, when she had a sudden, clear impulse to check her email before driving. She almost ignored it. She checked it. There was a message from a research institute she had contacted over a year earlier about a collaborative project, a message she had long since stopped expecting. They were interested. They wanted to talk. She filed it under coincidence and kept going. On day 5, a paper she had submitted to a journal 6 months earlier and received a lukewarm response on, was suddenly picked up by a different editor at the same journal who had read it independently and wanted to feature it. The original editor had not forwarded it. He had no idea the second editor had seen it. No one could explain the administrative path it had taken to reach that second set of eyes. On day 7, Calloway sat in her kitchen after finishing the morning session and looked at her research journal, which she had been keeping meticulously since long before any of this. She paged back through the entries from the previous years. She was looking for comparable clusters of positive professional development in any previous 7-day window. She checked 3 years of daily entries. There was nothing that came close. She was a scientist. She knew a sample size of 1 proved nothing. She knew confirmation bias was a real and powerful distortion. She knew all of that. And she sat in her kitchen in the early morning quiet and felt, for the first time in the entire process, genuinely unsettled. Not because the results were strange, because they were exactly what the mechanism she had spent weeks mapping out would predict. The instrument had been recalibrated. And a recalibrated instrument, in a world full of signals, starts receiving. She opened a new document and started writing. Not a research paper, not yet, just everything she had found, laid out in plain language, in order. She was going to need to show this to people who could push back on it, hard, because if it held up under that pressure, it was going to matter a great deal. What she did not know yet was that while she had been quietly running her own experiment, something else had been happening in the background, something that would reframe the entire story of how this practice had stayed hidden for so long, and why the people responsible for keeping it hidden had been so extraordinarily effective. The people who had been suppressing this practice for generations were not a fringe group. They were some of the most respected and financially successful individuals in the world, and they had been using this exact technique the entire time. Graves found out gradually, the way you find out most things that were hidden deliberately well. Not through a single dramatic revelation, but through a slow accumulation of small details that eventually formed a shape he could not ignore. It started with a name that kept appearing in unexpected places. An academic archive here, a private correspondence there, a footnote in a 19th century ethnographic survey that mentioned a small circle of collectors who had been systematically acquiring indigenous knowledge artifacts from Mesoamerica, specifically breathwork and ritual sequence documentation for several decades. The name attached to the founding of that circle was Old Money, the kind of family whose influence runs so deep in certain institutions that you stop noticing it the same way you stop noticing the walls of a room you spend every day in. Graves pulled the thread. It led to another name, then another. The circle had no formal title, no public presence, no membership list anywhere he could find. But the pattern of acquisitions it had generated over more than a century was traceable, if you knew what you were looking for. Private purchases of indigenous cultural materials, donations to specific university archives with unusual access restrictions attached, funding streams that went toward academic programs in related fields, programs that consistently produced research framing ancient knowledge systems as symbolic rather than functional. Not suppression in the dramatic sense, something quieter and more effective, a sustained multi-generational effort to ensure that any serious investigation into these practices got redirected toward interpretation and away from application, toward meaning and away from mechanism. The people running this effort were not keeping the techniques secret because they feared them. They were keeping them contained because they were using them, had been using them for generations, and understood exactly what the competitive advantage of doing so looked like over time. Graves spent a long time sitting with that. The families connected to this network were not outliers in terms of their success. They were, consistently, at the top. Generation after generation, across different industries and different eras, maintaining and expanding influence at a rate that ordinary explanations struggled to account for. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions, but the data he was looking at pointed in one direction, and he was honest enough to follow it there. The technique in that chamber had not been stumbled upon by this network recently. They had known about it, or about practices very closely related to it, for well over 100 years. And during that entire time, while the rest of the world was being guided toward treating ancient knowledge as mythology, they had been quietly applying it every morning before breakfast. That realization changed the emotional texture of everything Graves had been doing. It had started as curiosity. Then it became a personal practice. Then a shared experiment. Now it became something else. A question of fairness so large he barely knew how to hold it. The leak did not come the way leaks usually do, with anger or ideology or a dramatic confrontation. It came from an ending. An elderly man named Walter Eldridge had spent the better part of his adult life as a trusted administrator within the network Graves had been tracing. Not a founder, not a decision maker at the highest level. The kind of person who keeps the machinery running, who knows where everything is filed and why certain doors stay locked and what would happen if they were opened. He had been part of the operation long enough that he had stopped questioning it the way you stop questioning the grammar of your own language. It was simply the structure of the world as he understood it. Then he got sick. The serious kind. The kind that changes the speed at which you move through your days and makes the future feel very close and very specific. And something shifted in him during that period that he later described to the one person he chose to confide in as a door opening that he had kept shut for a very long time. He did not make a speech. He did not write a manifesto. He spent the last months of his life digitizing materials he had spent decades helping to keep inaccessible and distributing them quietly to people he had identified through careful observation as both trustworthy and genuinely committed to sharing rather than hoarding what they found. The only written thing he left behind was a single handwritten note discovered after his death, folded inside the cover of a logbook that documented decades of acquisition activity. The note said nothing about injustice or exposure or revenge. It said only that some things belonged to the current they were drawn from, not to whoever first figured out how to dam the river. When those materials reached Graves and Calloway, they spent 3 days going through them before either of them said much to the other. Because what Eldridge had released was not just confirmation of what Graves had suspected. It was the original source documentation. The full sequence, intact, annotated across generations by people who had practiced it continuously and recorded their refinements in meticulous detail. And it matched what Graves had reconstructed from memory almost perfectly. A few small variations, one additional layer he had not recovered. But the core, the 4-count rhythm, the hold, the specific focal progression, the 7-day structure, all of it was there, preserved and refined across more than a century of private application by people who had understood exactly what it was worth. Graves looked at Calloway across the table, covered in printed pages, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that they needed to decide what to do next very carefully, because what they were holding was not just interesting, it was complete. And complete meant it was ready. The research Calloway compiled after receiving Eldridge's materials did not just confirm the mechanism. It explained, point by point, why a technique this precise had produced such consistent results across such different people, in such different circumstances. And the explanation was not comfortable for anyone who preferred to believe that success is purely a function of effort and strategy. The starting point was something she had already mapped, but now understood more fully. The default state of the modern human nervous system is high beta, rapid, fragmented, reactive. It is the frequency of stress, of constant low-level alertness, of a brain that is always scanning for threats and never fully settling. Most people live there so continuously that they have no reference point for what a different state feels like. They assume it is simply what being awake means. In high beta, the reticular activating system, the brain's primary filter for incoming information, is calibrated for threat detection. It is extraordinarily good at noticing danger, conflict, and scarcity. It screens out enormous amounts of available information that does not fit those categories. Opportunity, connection, unexpected resources, these things exist in the environment constantly, but a nervous system locked in high beta is simply not tuned to receive them. They pass through the filter unnoticed, the way a radio receiver tuned to one frequency cannot hear a signal broadcasting on another, no matter how strong that signal is. The breath sequence from the chamber changes that, not permanently after one session, but consistently, cumulatively, across the 7-day cycle. Each morning session pushes the nervous system into theta, the frequency associated with deep relaxation, heightened creativity, and most importantly, a dramatic widening of the reticular filter. In theta, the brain begins noticing things it normally screens out: patterns, connections, openings. People whose paths cross yours in ways that create possibility. Timing that you would ordinarily miss because you were not paying attention to the right signals. Calloway cross-referenced this with the electromagnetic coherence data she had reviewed earlier. In deep, coherent breath work, the body's own field begins to synchronize with the low-frequency oscillation present in the environment. The same stable background frequency that exists everywhere and that most people's dysregulated nervous systems are too noisy to align with. That alignment does not attract things to you. It attunes you to things that are already moving in your direction, things you were previously too out of phase to detect or respond to in time. That was the mechanism. Not mystical, not metaphorical. A precise physiological recalibration of the instrument you use to navigate the world, designed by people who understood exactly what they were doing and refined over generations until it worked reliably every time it was used correctly. Graves read Calloway's full write-up in a single sitting. He said afterward that the strangest part was how unsurprised he felt. He had known something like this was true from the morning he had sat at his kitchen table breathing slowly over his field notes. He just had not had the vocabulary for it until now. They agreed it was time to share the complete practice. So here it is, exactly as it was designed, exactly as it has been used, privately and effectively, by people who had every reason to keep it to themselves. Find a quiet space in the morning, within the first hour and a half after waking, when your cortisol is naturally elevated and your brain is most alert and receptive. This timing is not arbitrary. Calloway's research confirmed that this specific window produces the most measurable shift in neural state from the practice. Sit upright, not rigid, just supported, shoulders relaxed. Hands open on your thighs, palms facing up. If there is natural light available, position yourself so it falls on your face or your hands. The body responds to light as an environmental signal, and that response supports the transition the practice is designed to create. Close your eyes. Take one slow breath in and out without counting, just to let your body register that something different is about to happen. Then begin the sequence. Breathe in slowly for exactly 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Exhale fully for 4 counts. That is one cycle. The counts should be slow and even, roughly 1 second each, though the exact pace matters less than the consistency. What the nervous system responds to is the regularity, the predictable rhythm that signals safety and allows the stress response to downshift. As you inhale, direct your attention to the center of your chest and hold a simple image there, a pale green light, steady and calm, collecting with each breath. Do not force the image. Let it be soft and approximate. The direction of attention matters more than the vividness of the visualization. During the hold, see that light expanding outward slowly from your chest, the way heat radiates from a warm surface. No rush, just a quiet, steady expansion filling the space around your body. On the exhale, release it deliberately outward, not scattered in all directions, but directed, the way you would send a message rather than make noise. A signal moving out into the environment around you. Repeat this cycle 9 times without interruption. 9 full breath cycles, each one exactly like the last. Do not count in your head while visualizing. Keep the count in the background, like a quiet internal metronome, while your attention stays with the light. When you finish the 9th cycle, sit with your eyes closed for a moment before opening them. Do not check your phone. Do not speak immediately. Give the state you have just created 30 seconds to settle before you bring the rest of your day into contact with it. That is the foundation layer. One session takes roughly 10 minutes. And what Graves and Calloway both found, and what thousands of people in the practice group confirmed, is that by day 3, the morning session begins to feel distinctly different from day 1. Something in the rhythm becomes familiar to the body. The transition into the theta state becomes faster. The filter begins to open more easily. And things start appearing in the periphery of your awareness that you had been walking past without seeing. But the foundation is only the beginning. Because what Elridge's materials revealed about the second layer of the practice, the one that amplifies everything the foundation creates, was something neither Graves nor Calloway had fully anticipated. The second layer of the practice nearly broke 2 people who tried to use it without the foundation in place. That is not a metaphor. Calloway documented both cases personally. The materials Elridge had released included annotations from multiple generations of practitioners within the network, people who had used the technique continuously and recorded their observations in careful detail. Those annotations were consistent on one point above all others. The second layer is not an addition. It is an amplifier. And an amplifier connected to a signal that is not yet stable does not make the signal stronger. It makes the instability louder. Both people who had problems were in Graves' extended group. Both had started the second layer before fully completing the foundation cycle, impatient for results, assuming that more was better. One experienced a period of what she described as everything going sideways at once, professional relationships souring, decisions that felt right in the moment turning out badly, a general sense of things moving in the wrong direction across multiple areas of her life simultaneously. The other reported something more internal, a kind of relentless mental noise, an inability to settle, days of feeling simultaneously wired and exhausted with no clear cause. Both recovered fully after returning to the foundation layer and completing the 7-day cycle correctly before attempting anything further. Calloway noted in her documentation that the physiological explanation was straightforward. The second layer involves a significantly more intense engagement of the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network simultaneously. Without the neural coherence established by the foundation practice, that engagement creates competition between systems rather than integration. The brain ends up pulling in 2 directions at once, and a brain pulling in 2 directions at once is a brain that is very good at making poor decisions and very bad at noticing opportunity. The second layer, done correctly, works like this. You complete the 9 foundation cycles exactly as before. Then, without pausing, you continue into a second set of 9 cycles. The breath rhythm stays identical. What changes is where your attention goes during each phase. On the inhale, instead of the general image of light collecting in your chest, You bring your attention to a specific point at the center of your forehead. Not a visualization of something placed there, just your attention resting at that point, alert and still, the way you might focus your eyes on a single fixed point in the distance to steady yourself. The Eldridge materials describe this as opening the forward window, the direction of what is coming toward you rather than what you are generating outward. During the hold, you hold a single image, not a scene or a story, one specific thing, the clearest, most concrete version of the most important outcome you are working toward. Not how you will feel when it happens, not the journey toward it, the thing itself, already present, already real. The annotations in Eldridge's materials were emphatic on this point. Vague intentions produce vague results. The nervous system needs a precise target to orient toward. On the exhale, you shift attention to the base of your spine and imagine a slow, deep release downward, like roots extending through the floor beneath you, anchoring the intention into the physical rather than letting it remain abstract and weightless. 9 cycles of that, following directly from the 9 foundation cycles. Callaway found that during the second layer cycles, EEG patterns in participants showed something distinct from the foundation layer alone. The theta state was maintained, but there was an additional activation in areas associated with future simulation and goal-directed attention. The brain was not just open, it was open and oriented, tuned to a specific signal rather than simply receiving whatever came through. That combination, broad receptivity plus precise orientation, was what produced the consistency in outcomes that Graves had documented across thousands of participants. The full session, foundation plus second layer, runs to roughly 20 minutes, long enough to create a measurable shift, short enough to do every morning without it becoming a burden. And that, Graves said when he first outlined the complete practice to a larger group, is not accidental. The people who designed this understood something fundamental about human behavior that most modern productivity systems ignore entirely. A practice that takes 45 minutes gets skipped on hard days. A practice that takes 20 minutes becomes a habit. And it is the habit, the daily repetition across 7 days, that creates the cumulative effect. But the 7 days are not uniform. The structure of the cycle across the week matters as much as the daily practice itself. And days 1 through 5 are only preparation for what happens on days 6 and 7, which function differently from everything that precedes them and produce the most dramatic shift in the entire cycle. What Eldridge's annotations described for those final 2 days was something Graves had not fully reconstructed from memory. And when Callaway read those pages for the first time, she sat with them for a long time before she said anything. A man named Marcus came into Graves' extended group at the lowest point of his life. And what happened to him across 7 days is the clearest example I have found of what this practice actually does when someone follows it without cutting corners. Marcus had been self-employed for several years, doing well enough for a while, then slowly not well enough, then quietly falling apart in that specific way that self-employed people fall apart, where the outside looks roughly fine for a long time, while the inside is already in serious trouble. A marriage that had been strained for years finally ended. A major client relationship collapsed the same month. A legal dispute over a contract ate through his savings in a way that felt almost deliberate in its timing, as if everything had agreed to go wrong at once. He was not dramatic about any of it. He just got very quiet and very still, the way people do when they have run out of the energy required to pretend. A friend who was in Graves' group sent him the practice sequence with a short message that said only, "Trust me, just do it for 7 days." Marcus almost did not. He told me later that the reason he finally started was not hope. It was that he had nothing left to protect. He was not afraid of it not working because he had already stopped expecting things to work. That absence of resistance, that particular kind of exhausted openness, may have been exactly what the practice needed to take hold quickly. He started on a Tuesday morning, sitting on the floor of his home office because his desk chair had broken and he had not bothered replacing it yet. Pale light coming through the window, the kind of quiet that only exists in the very early morning before the day has weight to it. He followed the foundation layer exactly. 9 cycles, the pale green light in his chest, the steady outward pulse during the hold, the deliberate, directed exhale. He said it felt strange the first time. Not bad strange, just unfamiliar, like using a muscle he had forgotten he had. Day 2 felt marginally more familiar. Day 3, something shifted. He could not describe it precisely, which is consistent with what almost everyone in the practice group reported around day 3. Not a dramatic change, more like a subtle adjustment in the quality of attention. The sense of moving through the day slightly more awake than usual, noticing small things he would normally walk past. A comment from someone he ran into that suddenly connected to a problem he had been turning over for weeks. A piece of information in an article he almost did not read that answered a question he had not even fully articulated yet. On day 4, the former client called, the one whose contract dispute had cost him so much. Not with an apology. With a referral, a contact at a company with a project that turned out to be exactly the kind of work Marcus was built for. He took the call standing in his kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was that the world was not finished with him yet. On day 6, the legal matter that had been grinding through the system for months resolved in a single conversation that lasted less than 15 minutes. The terms were better than his lawyer had told him to expect. His lawyer had no explanation for why the other party suddenly became cooperative. On day 7, Marcus did the extended session. 30 minutes, both layers, his single intention held steady throughout. He sat afterward in that broken chair in the early morning light and did not move for a long time. Not because he was overwhelmed, because something had settled in him that had not been settled in years, and he did not want to disturb it before he had a chance to really feel what it was like. He wrote in his journal that morning, the journal Graves had asked all participants to keep, a single line. He wrote that he felt like a receiver that had finally been tuned, not fixed, not saved, just aligned, pointed in the right direction, picking up signals that had always been broadcasting. That is the most accurate description of what this practice does that I have encountered across all the documentation, all the research, all the thousands of participant accounts. It does not rescue you. It does not override reality. It recalibrates the instrument through which you experience and respond to reality. And a recalibrated instrument in a world full of moving signals is an entirely different thing from a broken one. Marcus rebuilt his business over the following months, steadily, without drama. The referral from that day 4 phone call led to a contract that stabilized everything. The resolved legal matter freed up resources he had mentally written off. 2 other relationships that had been dormant reactivated in ways that created new professional ground. None of it felt like magic. All of it felt like the natural movement of someone who had stopped accidentally blocking their own path. He still does the morning practice, not every single day, but most of them. He told a friend in the group that skipping it feels like going out in winter without a coat. You can do it. You just notice the difference immediately. Here is what I take from all of this. From Graves in that chamber, to Calloway's research, to Elridge's quiet act of returning something that had been taken, to Marcus on the floor of his office in the early morning light. Abundance is not a reward for the right strategy, or the right connections, or the right amount of effort. It is a state of reception. And most of us spend our entire lives in a state that makes reception nearly impossible. Running too hot, too fast, too fragmented to pick up the signals that are constantly moving through the environment around us. The practice from that chamber does not give you something you did not have. It removes the interference that was preventing you from receiving what was already there. The people who kept this hidden understood that. They understood it so well, they spent generations making sure no one else would. And the question that I keep coming back to, the one I think deserves a real answer, is this. If you had known about this practice 10 years ago, where would you be right now? Not a rhetorical question, a real one. Think about the doors that were in front of you that you walked past without seeing them. Think about the timing you missed, the connections that almost happened, the opportunities that passed through your life while your filter was set to the wrong frequency. Write your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know. And because your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to finally start. If this story reached you for a reason, give it a like and subscribe so the next part of this finds you just as easily.